The new Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon, writes her agency should prepare for a, quote, momentous final mission. President Trump has said he intends to eliminate the department after taking steps to close the U.S. Agency for International Development and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Chris Mihm is adjunct professor of public administration and international affairs at Syracuse University. He's former director of strategic issues at the Government Accountability Office. Loren DeJonge Schulman is founder and principal at Telos Lab. She's former associate director for performance at the Office of Management and Budget. Welcome, folks. Thanks for joining me. Chris, I start with you, and I take you back to GAO. One of my favorite GAO phrases, leading practices.
Yes, sir.
Are there leading practices for consolidating and closing agencies' capacity or the agencies themselves?
Yeah, fortunately, the answer to that is yes. And we, and not just GAO, but many other agencies and organizations as well, have done a lot of work on that. There's a couple of things that really come to the top, though, that are really absolutely essential on those. One is that that successful efforts just don't view it as a downsizing or cutting staff or cutting cost. Rather, it's part of a larger package of reforms that organizations put in place if they want to actually increase effectiveness when all of this is over. So they make sure that they have the right institutional culture in place. That is a culture of informed risk, a culture in which organizations are actually using evidence to improve performance, and that individual line managers have the authority to act on the evidence that they find. So one of that key aspects of that is making sure that is part of a larger package of reforms. A second thing that's also very important to that is that they understand that for most of the problems that government seeks to achieve or address, rather, especially at the federal level, it's going to be, the success of that is going to be organizations working across boundaries, whether it be agencies, whether it be state and local governments as well, whether it be across sectors on that. And so in many ways, it's managing the white space, as it were, across organizations that's going to lead to increased performance. And so successful change efforts understand that it's not just reforming your own individual organization, it's also looking at the partners and the delivery partners that are also going to be impacted by that. A third key area on that is engagement with your staff and your stakeholders. All too often what we find is that if communication exists, it's just one way, in a sense of the center telling the periphery, meaning the staff, this is what we're going to do, without really explaining how or why or what the ultimate goal is, or more important, not having active listening. That is hearing back from them about what they're doing. And then a fourth and absolutely vital one on this, and shout out to Loren and her colleagues at OMB, because when she was there, we really made progress on this, is making sure that you have a dedicated implementation team. All too often you have these big change initiatives that are announced, and then 6 months later we all wonder why did it crash and burn, or why did nothing come from this? Well, it's because we didn't have a dedicated implementation team like they did in permitting, like they did on personnel security clearances, on reductions of administrative burden, on the customer experience. That's making sure that you have people that set up how we're going to do this, making sure that you have the resources. If you can get those four key elements, you can downsize, you can right size, and you can also increase effectiveness when all of this is said and done.
One of the things that you and I talked about any number of times when you were on this show, both when you were in government and before you went back into OMB, was the fact that there were names attached to a lot of those things that you talked about, especially when you would come on and talk about the president's management agenda, Loren. You had the stakeholder owners, names, faces, and so on, attached to each one of those things. What was the significance of that?
So Chris's point about having folks who are in charge viewing this as an implementation effort and not just something that is, we're trying to aim towards cuts, but that we're actually trying to aim towards a long-term goal. I think there's a couple of points on that are really critical. One is having somebody who is not just working towards how many dollars and people can I cut, but what is the outcome that I'm driving towards? How does this link to my public mission, the public assets that we've generated over the many years? Where are those going to go? Like, where is it we're going to take all of the incredible outcomes that we've built up over time, and what is the overall the direction, the landing space, the result that we're driving towards in that. The second, when it comes, the really important piece of this in terms of having an owner is the people part that you mentioned here, where we're talking about thousands of public servants who have signed up for a mission, they took an oath, they have been working on these issues for a long period of time. They may be asked to go do something different, they may be asked to leave their roles, they may not know the outcome of that. Having somebody who feels as though it is the responsibility to understand the culture, understand the impact on those individuals and is taking responsibility for not only how they perform the duties now, but how they exit, is incredibly critical to the success of this, but also the long-term role of public service in the public sector. The other really key piece that you brought up that I think is so important is the white space, where federal missions don't just take place within the buildings that they work in. They touch implementers, they touch state and local governments, they touch data analysts, universities all around the country. Thinking through, as you're doing these consolidations, how is this going to impact that journey of the work, this stakeholder network that we've built over time? Who could take up some of these missions? Who could take up some of the data? Who might take up some of the individuals? How can we disperse some of the incredible public assets and public benefits we've developed over time so that they have a long-term impact, even if not necessarily within the bounds of Department of Education or USAID?
I didn't hear anything on that list of things that people should be considering that should be deal breakers, that should cause anybody to say, oh, well, that's going to be too hard, and so we shouldn't do it. So I don't hear anything that's holding anybody back from making some of the changes that people are talking about.
To me, I think one of the most critical things is the Trump administration and the leaders of these agencies are thinking through, how do I move my agency in a new direction, consolidate, and the role here is to recognize that these are public organizations, public employees, public missions, public benefits that the American people have invested in over the past however many decades. And to see those not only as something that they need to put into cold storage, but to understand the benefit of and where it goes over the future, to me, that's not even just like not a deal breaker. It's something that should be an obligation for the oath that we're taking as public servants. And there's no law, there's no resource limitations. This should be a natural part of consolidation and looking into the future for these teams.
One of the things that you've talked about all the time too, to me, Chris, is outcomes and making sure that outcomes, mission delivery, is kind of the gold standard. What is the biggest challenge in preserving the mission delivery at the same time one is doing whatever consolidation or movement that one is doing?
Well, I think there are two big challenges, actually. One is just being very clear about the outcomes that you want to achieve, and outcomes in the sense of demonstrable results and impact on behalf of the American people, not just a kind of processes or this is how often we did something, an output or something, but really making sure that we're focusing on those outcomes, articulating those, how are we going to measure those. That's all what the legislation of GPRA and GPRA modernization, all this stuff that's so close to my heart was about, but making sure that we have that. The second, and I think actually, the vital element on that is then linking very carefully what you're doing on a day-to-day basis to the outcomes that you're trying to achieve. And this is where it becomes so important that we just don't willy-nilly or just go in and slash data analytics units or evidence units or program evaluation. We need to understand what is the relationship between our daily activities and the outcomes that we're seeking to achieve. If we can get those clarity on goals and then also understanding those relationships, we're going to be in a pretty good space.
The last thing I would add on top of that is to make sure that we're being as clear and transparent to the American people as possible. Yep. So when a program is going to change, when it's going to go in a different direction, when it's going to go away, to talk about not only where we have been, where it's going to go, but also the likely impact on their day-to-day, how they may receive benefits, how they may get information, who they should turn to instead. These are very doable actions that the current administration can take in order to effectively transition the work that they want to do.
What's the why there? Why is it important for that to happen?
So many Americans only hear about where change is going to happen in government or challenges with government. They don't often hear, what does government do every day? How does this actually affect them day to day? And that may not be relevant on a regular basis, but when you're fundamentally changing overall aid programs or Department of Education research programs or otherwise, this may have immediate effects or longer term effects. And again, coming back to that public assets, public benefits, public resources, we can tell the American people, here's what we were doing before, we're going to do it differently, and here's why, and here's how you might experience it, so that they have a good understanding of not only why things are changing, but where it's going to go over time.
And part of that, if I could just jump in for a moment, is I think part of it is, and this is all the great work that Loren did when she was in government, is focusing on the customer experience, is understanding what is the impact of all of these programs when it actually gets down to the individual taxpayer, the individual program recipient, how they are going to experience the government, and as Loren was pointing out, how that will change. And making sure that we're clear about that, we're talking to people about that, and we're measuring that performance. We're measuring not just their satisfaction, but how are we doing in helping the individuals, the clients, the customers achieve what they want to achieve with why they came to government or why they came to a government service.
And that shouldn't be something that's open to tremendous debate, because it wasn't just your PMA that included a customer experience element. The first Trump administration's PMA also included changing the way that citizens experience the government.
There was a tremendous amount of work in the Trump administration, particularly at the VA, Veterans Administration, that looked at the journey of veterans as they go through receiving medical benefits or otherwise. And so many of those tactics that they applied and learned there, we spread across the rest of government and could be actually quite applicable to the conversation that we're having right now. How do these changes impact the regular citizen as they are crossing a border, as they're flying, as they are getting veterans benefits, as they are applying for student aid? How does the change impact them as they are going to click that button or fill out that form?
And Francis, as we know, the first set of customer service standards goes back to the National Performance Review in the Clinton administration. And in fact, in many ways, that model has endured, focusing on the high-impact service providers or high-impact agencies, those agencies that have over 95% of citizen interactions with the federal government. If we can get that right, if we can change and improve those sets of relationships, we can probably have knock-on effects overall on how people have trust in government. And so this is, again, why the work that Loren and her team were doing was so important.
All right, go ahead.
One of the things I have, I guess, appreciated about how the current administration is approaching is recognizing that they may pursue things that they have to reverse and make mistakes. And I think that allowing for some of that reversibility as they learn about how these changes are going to impact Americans, as they see how they may have long-term changes that may not, be as understandable today, if they can build in some of the documentation, keep things alive, keep it documented so that if you do need to go back and reverse it, it's possible to do, that will be a huge gift to all of their successors as well.
And it can be audited.
And that's what's really important.
That's the real reason we want
that's what's really important.
There's a lot more I'd love to cover, but we're out of time. Loren, Chris, it's wonderful to have you on the program. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you.